Hey guys, I'm Andrea Dunlop, and today is the third in my new series about book publishing and race. So in the first two videos, I talked about the disparities in employment numbers behind the scenes in publishing, the issue of comp titles and race and how that shakes out. And today I'm going to be talking about the actual pay disparity in author advances and the controversy around the hashtag publishing paid me. So if you haven't watched those first two videos, I suggest you go back and check them out because they are important context for today's video. I also did some slides on my Instagram if those are easier for you to go back and check so you can just get the gist. Okay, so before we jump into the hashtag, let's talk a little bit about how author advances actually work. So an advance on royalties is the big lump sum that an author gets when a publisher buys their book. This sum is calculated by the editor trying to figure out how many copies they think that the publisher of the book can sell and working backwards. So say you think you can sell 10,000 copies of a book and you say, for instance, that the author's portion of each book is $1, then you can confidently offer that author a $10,000 advance knowing that the publisher is likely to make that money back. Now, authors receive these lump sums in usually 3 to 4 payments, one upon signing, one upon delivery, etc. And they don't receive any additional money until the book earns out. And that's what it's called when the book makes back the amount of money the publisher spent on the advance. So now again, how this advance is calculated mostly involves the use of comp titles. So that is looking at similar books and determining how many copies those books sold, and then trying to figure out how many books a book that's unpublished might sell. Based on these numbers, an editor puts together what's called a profit and loss statement, so a P&L, and presents it to the team in-house. So if this all sounds incredibly inexact and subjective, it definitely is. I really love this quote from a journalist called Constance Grady, who wrote a great piece in Vox about the publishing paid me controversy, and she also used to work as a book editor, and this is what she has to say about P&Ls. Some projections are based on real numbers, like sales history of comparative titles, but publishers decide which books are similar to which, and hence which monumental successes should be taken into account and which failures should be ignored through hunches and guesswork and educated bullshitting. And in fact, only 30% of books earn through their advances, which doesn't mean to say that the publishers don't make any money on those remaining 70% of books, and it doesn't mean that publishers are always necessarily getting it wrong. It just goes to show how very, very difficult it is to predict how many copies a book will sell before it's on the market, especially when we're talking about debuts. Okay, so why do advances matter so much? Well, for one thing, since 70% of authors, that's the only money that they're going to see from a book because it's not going to earn through and earn them additional royalties, advances matter a ton. That's the money that you're getting in exchange for giving up the rights to your book. So that money can provide time for an author to write a follow-up book, just additional time for them to promote their book, and live their life, do their day job, parent, what have you. Obviously it matters for that reason. Advances also matter a great deal because that's sort of a sign of where the publisher is prioritizing a book. So obviously the more money that a publisher spends on an author's advance, the higher they're going to have that book in their priority list of which to promote. It makes sense because there's a much more of an incentive for them to try and earn that money back. So in some ways, big advances can become sort of self-fulfilling prophecies, and the opposite is also obviously true. Okay, so on to the hashtag. So the hashtag publishing paid me was created by young adult author LL McKinney during a conversation on Twitter about lack of transparency around author advances. And it was created to encourage authors to share how much money they were getting from publishers for their advances. And this happened around June 5th, I believe. So it's important to mention here that there's really a lot of secrecy around author advances. I think in some ways this is true across the board for, that people don't necessarily share how much money they make. But I think it is especially opaque in the publishing industry. Even our main trade publication, Publishers Weekly, has this kind of funny system where they say how much a book went for at auction or what have you, but they don't use exact terms. So they say very nice deal to indicate one pay range, major deal to indicate another, etc. So, what this leaves us with is one of these situations where most of us suspect that BIPOC authors are being paid less than white authors, because that would be consistent with what we know about literally every other industry and institution in America, but we haven't really had much data to back that up. But the outpouring on the Publishing Paid Me hashtag really underscores that this suspicion has a lot of merit. Okay, so there was a lot of conversation back and forth using this hashtag, and people were reporting publicly how much they made on their advances in some cases. There was also an anonymous spreadsheet where authors could go and log in and give some data. So basically, without using their name, offer their race, their gender, what genre they were writing in, and what their advance was. So New York Times compiled that data and took a look at it, and of the 122 writers who said they earned at least $100,000 on an advance, 78 of them identified as white, 7 as Black, and 2 said they were Latinx. So if you look at the other numbers that we've been looking at in terms of employment, comp titles, those really line up. So you can sort of see the effects that it's having downstream. I think the biggest conversation starters were some of the shockers that came out of this conversation on Twitter in terms of authors sharing publicly what they've gotten for a book. So one that really stuck with me, Roxanne Gay, who's a writer that just everyone I know has heard of. She is who I think of as a major American writer, was paid $15,000 for Bad Feminist, which went on to become a New York Times bestseller. She's reported that she got $150,000 for her most recent book, which is a really solid advance. But again, to be honest, not as high as I would expect. Another one that a lot of people are talking about is Jessamine Ward. So Jessamine Ward is someone, again, that I think of as just this really preeminent American writer. She's won 2 National Book Awards. She's well known, incredibly celebrated. She received $20,000 advance for her debut novel, Salvage the Bones. And she reports that she and her agent had to wrestle to get $100,000 advance for her next book, even after she won the National Book Award. And as I mentioned, she's won it twice, which is a pretty rare feat. Another one who's making a lot of headlines is N.K. Jemisin, who is a sci-fi fantasy writer who's won the Hugo Award 3 times in a row. She's the only writer to ever do this. And she won it for her Broken Earth trilogy. Those books went for $25,000 a piece. So I want to contrast this with a couple of white authors who shared their advances. And again, I want to say here, obviously the intent is not to shame these people who shared. It was completely voluntary, and good on them for sharing and probably knowing that they would get some blowback. So one of them that really, again, stuck out to me, especially when you contrast it with Jessamine Ward, as he did actually in his tweet when he shared this information, the writer Chip Creek received $800,000 for his debut, Cape May. So nothing against Chip Creek. I actually have it on good authority that he's a nice dude, but that is 40 times what Jessamine Ward got paid for Salvage the Bones in her advance. Another one that really stuck out to me as a good contrast piece is Mandy Lynn Cantrim, who reported on Twitter that she was paid $400,000 for her debut, which is called How to Fall in Love with Anyone. And again, and she sold that following an essay that went viral. So again, if you contrast that with Bad Feminist, she made a little bit more than 26 times what Roxanne Gay made. So there was numerous other authors who came forward with stories about 100K plus advances for debuts, and not a single BIPOC author who did, to my knowledge. So there's definitely a separate question here as to whether huge advances for debut books are really a good idea for anyone, but nonetheless, it's the disparity that is notable. Now, obviously, the data here is incomplete. We need more data. We need more transparency, but nonetheless, I find it really telling. There was a great quote again in this Vox article that I mentioned earlier from the author who started the hashtag Publishing Paid Me. LL McKinney is her name. And she said, "I want Black authors to be paid what they're worth. I want publishing to shift its idea of what a universal stories are. White stories are seen as universal. Black stories are seen as niche. Why is that?" that definitely jives with my experience within publishing and some of my conversations, in this industry over the last 16 years that I've been involved with it. It definitely does not jive with my experience as a reader or my experience observing other readers on a place like Bookstagram, where I think actually there's a much wider net as to what's considered a universal or a quote kind of relatable story. Okay, so I just want to take a minute to kind of tie these three ideas together, so that I've kind of been covering in these last few videos. So behind the scenes, you have 86% of the people who are working in editorial. So those are the people who are making these acquisitions decisions that we're talking about. 86% of those folks are white. According to that wonderful article that I pointed out from Laura B. McGrath, who crunched a whole bunch of numbers on comp titles, the vast majority of comp titles that are being used to determine which books a publisher should buy and how much they should pay for them are by white authors. And what this all results in, as you would expect that it would, is lower advances for BIPOC authors, which is what's sort of been uncovered by this Publishing Paid Me hashtag. Okay, so what's the upshot here? I want to say that I think it's really important not to get too hung up on intentions. This conversation is not about one individual editor or one publisher being racist. These are systemic issues. We, as white people in this industry and everywhere, bring our histories and our biases with us. And so, none of this data really should be truly shocking. These are systemic issues and they need to be addressed accordingly. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about some of the people and organizations who are pushing for change and how we can all support them.